So we're going to start out today continuing from where we left off last week. There were two paragraphs in the section on the chapter on Pythagorasy in political ponerology that we didn't get to. I want to read those two paragraphs and then talk about two papers that I found online. I believe they were, looks like they might have been talks given at a conference somewhere, not quite sure. But I'll read the paragraphs and then you'll see how the papers are relevant. So this is Andrew Lobachevsky writing in Political Ponerology in Chapter 5. The main ideology, this is of Pythagorasy, succumbs to symptomatic deformation. In keeping with the characteristic style of this very disease, and with what has already been stated about the matter. This is in the stuff that we've talked about in the previous show and previous shows before that. The names and official contents are kept, but another completely different content is insinuated underneath, thus giving rise to the well-known double talk phenomenon within which the same names have two meanings, one for initiates, one for everyone else. The latter is derived from the original ideology. The former has a specific pathocratic meaning, something which is known not only to the pathocrats themselves, but also is learned by those people living under long-term subjection to their rule. Double talk is one of many symptoms. Others are the specific facility for producing new names which have suggestive effects and are actually and which are accepted virtually uncritically, in particular outside the immediate scope of such a system's rule. We must thus point out the paramoralistic character and paranoidal qualities frequently contained within these names. The action of paralogisms and paramoralisms in this deformed ideology becomes comprehensible to us based on the information presented in Chapter 4. Anything which threatens pathocratic rule becomes deeply immoral. This also applies to the concept of forgiving the pathocrats themselves. It is extremely dangerous and thus immoral. And then just skipping ahead, there's just one other short paragraph that's related to this. Pythagorasy survives thanks to the feeling of being threatened by the society of normal people, as well as by other countries wherein various forms of the system of normal man persist. For the rulers, staying on the top is therefore the classic problem of to be or not to be. In other words, it's an existential problem. It's a life or death situation to stay at the top and to keep your position there. So the two papers that I found are, let me read them. Totalitarian Dictionary of Czech by František Čermák. Sorry, completely butchering those names. And A Small Dictionary of Life Under Communist Totalitarian Rule, Czechoslovakia, 1948 to 1989, by Vera Šmídtová. These are both Czech researchers, Czech writers. And first I'll describe their project. So this Totalitarian Dictionary of Czech was developed and put together by a few researchers over there, including Čermák and several others. Again, I won't pronounce their names because I have no idea how to do that. But the idea was this: they took like a representative sample of writings from three periods in Czech history. So these are Czech language writings. One was from I think it was all of the front pages of one of the big newspapers of the time, and then various propaganda pamphlets and books and writings. And they scanned all of these documents and corrected them and basically created a lexicon, like a dictionary or just a word list of all the words used in these publications for three periods of time. Like one was in 1952, right at the beginning, right after the institution of communist rule in Czechoslovakia, and then during the Soviet occupation, and was it 1968? And then in the first quarter of 1977, so this was time during a deep social recession and depression. So they took all of these, got all the words, rank ordered them, so the most used words and down to the least used words. And then by analyzing that with the known frequency of Czech words in the 90s and the 2000s, were able to get like a kind of a relative comparison. So like they could say, well, during like the entire communist era, this word was used like way more. In fact, it's not even used anymore. Or like in this one period from those 3 periods of communist rule, this word was used a lot comparatively to the other periods and to modern Czech. Or these words in modern Czech are used and they were never used in the communist period, and so on. And so by looking at the words in this way, they were able to identify a lot of like the slogans and catchphrases and just the vocabulary of the communist system at the time. Because like in those quotes from Lobachevsky, the point he makes, and which he makes in other parts in the book too, is that language is a big part of what's going on in the pathocracy. Language is perverted. It is reshaped in such a way to be used in the service of this pathocratic government. So this is, of course, George Orwell nailed this in 1984, and that's where we get the word double talk, even though it wasn't double talk. It's like newspeak or doublethink. Those kind of just got combined together for double talk or doublespeak. But the concept is there. The like war is peace. The subversion of language and the institution, the introduction of new meanings, and just the kind of not only the perversion of language, but the simplification of language. Like one of the points that these researchers make is that the language in like the Soviet propaganda, or the communist socialist propaganda at the time was very simplistic, very repetitive, very like it just has this quality to it. Like it's identifiable when you see it. It just stands out to you. Like you can see this in the like the modern day like discourse, like in like leftist academia, for instance. You can listen to someone talking for 30 seconds and know if they're like a progressive ideologist or not, because they talk the same way. They have the same like stereotypical phrases and word uses, and to the point where if they're using it, you can identify it immediately. It's the same thing with the communist propaganda back then. So just a bit on the background of this project, or some more on the background. So one of the things that Chermak writes in this short paper is that one of the motivations for doing this is that he found that like the young people today, they have no notion of what it was like to live under communist rule, and even people who did seem to have forgotten very fast. Like the way he puts it is that whether too soon or too late, the decision to do this project was precipitated by realizing how fast people tend to forget the totalitarian time, the young generation not knowing it at all. However, it seems that it is through the vocabulary of a period that one gets to know it best. So that's what motivated this project. So he gives one example of a word that was, it's not all totally like politically motivated. So there were some words that were just used and introduced that were just characteristic of the time in the system. So for example, in Czech, it was the word, I'll read the English, agrobiological. Like the word agrobiological was used all the time in the press, and it's used nowhere like today. It's a pretty neutral word, right? It's not like no overtly political connotations, but it was just one of those things that the communist system just like appropriated. It's like, okay, here's this word, and then it just becomes this kind of catchphrase that's used in all kinds of different contexts, whereas like today, no one uses it. But then you get words with more of like an emotional subtext to them. This is what Lobachevsky called or referred to in those quotes that I read as like the suggestive character of these words. So they acquire this kind of like hidden, almost like hypnotic force behind them, where you read the word and there's just all of this like emotional connotation, denotation to this word that isn't inherent in the word itself. It's like the word itself has probably been used, in the history of that language, but without the added like emotional flavor and like that emotional subtext that's like underlying it. So for example, he uses the word, he refers to the word bezmezne, which means boundlessly, infinitely, immensely, and how that word, the use of that word has changed in time, between the present and back in the communist times. Back then, the word was used, to basically refer. Well, back then, one of the stock phrases was immensely devoted to the USSR. So if you'd see that word, chances are you were seeing it in reference to something relating to Soviet, to anything Soviet. It was like that's what it was. You were if you were immensely, then chances are you had to be immensely devoted to the USSR. That's what immensely meant. Whereas today, the meaning has changed. Back to its original meaning. It just means like in modern Czech, it just means to infinitely believe in something. It just means you strongly believe in something. None of that like hidden suggestive meaning behind it. It's just, oh, you immensely believe in that. Oh, I really believe in that. It's like...
Yeah, whereas back then, if you immensely believed in anything, it had to be the USSR, right?
Yeah. Another example that this guy gives is the word for struggle or fight. And how, so all the different like phrases that it was used for, like the workers' struggle, the people's fight for peace, the fight of nations for peace, the proletariat struggle, the ideological struggle, the struggle of ideas, organized fight of the workers, support fight of the nations, revolutionary fight, develop struggle against imperialism, develop the fight for peace, fight on those, the fight of those on strike, the class struggle, to direct the fight of the workers' class, etc. So all of these, like obviously ideological phrases, all using the word fight. So he comments, on closer inspection, it is evident that the society lived then in a state of frenzy, feeling both endangered from the outside and feeling that it must fight for almost everything, including even the most common everyday things. So again, we have this language that's kind of, this concept creep, this language that's creeping into other areas of life. So you have these specific situations where, the word for fight would have been used previously. You bring in the communist government, and all of a sudden, the fight is applied, the concept of struggle and fighting is applied to all of these other scenarios and situations where, an entirely new and entirely, well, some fictitious and some just created out of nowhere scenarios, like all these different fights that people have to be involved in, whereas, previously it was just, okay, that was a fight, that was a struggle, and same today, right? But it acquired this additional ideological meaning during this entire period. So he goes on, he's got some specific examples, like just to give an example of the frequency of these of these words. He gives just a sample of these words, and one of them is Adolf, so in reference to Adolf Hitler. So in 1952, the frequency of this word was 6 parts per million. Compare that with the word agent, 263 parts per million. So this was, of course, an agent of Tito, an imperialist agent, agent of the bourgeoisie. This was one of those words, again, a word previously used, has an agreed upon meaning, part of the common parlance, that acquires a new meaning, a new added flavor to it. Now, once it's appropriated by the regime. Same with the word American. American became not just a geographical sense. American was used as a pejorative to describe anything with the description American had to be bad. And it was equated with capitalism. So not only did it have the suggestive value of being bad and immoral, it was then equated with something that was related but not equivalent, capitalism. So American meant capitalism. If you're talking about an American something, you were talking about a capitalist something. So Americans thereby were then equated to capitalists. Every American was a capitalist. Was every capitalist an American? I don't know. I'll have to ask Aristotle. But the frequency of the word American compared to agent at 263 parts per million, it was 2,527 parts per million. That's actually the most used word in this short sample. So in this other paper, part of the same project by Vera Schmidtova, she gives some more in-depth examples of the way that words were used. let me just skip ahead to the back before we get to the examples. I want to read some of her analysis of what she has to say about this. So I'm just going to read her conclusion in this paper. As we would expect under any political system, the language of totalitarianism in the former Czechoslovakia works within the semantic structure of Czech. However, it uses this structure for propaganda purposes, so words from the usual vocabulary are often abused to propaganda ends. So it's, American, agent, struggle, war. The language is aggressive and monotonous. It frequently repeats certain associations, phrases, and slogans. Now, this is why these words just, you see them everywhere. They're like just pat stereotypical responses. That's why that's why she uses the word monotonous. That's the way it is to read these kind of things. It's just like mind torture to read the same garbage, over and over, the same pat phrases and just repetitive words. To certain words, this is related to the suggestive effect that Lobachevsky talks about. To certain words, it adds its own evaluating positive or negative gloss. For example, the word American always has a negative semantic connotation, even though it is referring to a geographical concept. The word Soviet is always positive. Totalitarianism often abuses to its ideological ends words with a positive semantic connotation. It creates new meanings for words by expanding their polysemy. For example, Western equals capitalist. I mentioned that one. It is fond of certain semantic connections, such as building a better future, the struggle against enemies of the new order, democratization of culture and education, which is a veiled reference to censorship in these fields. So I had to reread that the first time I looked at it, because think about that. Okay, democratization of culture and education. What does that mean? Well, it sounds like democratization of culture and education, right? Well, no, it was actually a reference to censoring, cultural departments and universities. It's like, okay. Going on just a bit more here. With the aim of concealment, it often uses euphemisms, struggle for liberation, example. This language is not creative. It draws from automatized components of language. It often uses set phrases. To this day, users often apply these phrases as ironic quotes referring to the period. So I think I mentioned this at the beginning of the show. It's so monotonous and and just over the top and in your face that it becomes a joke. It becomes its own joke, to the point where people are still using these phrases as jokes today because they were so ridiculous at the time. She goes on, the various tools of propaganda, techniques of persuasion, brainwashing, euphemisms, separate people into those who are with us and those who are against us, into the good and the bad. Words take on new meanings, which have a political sense. Linguistic stereotypes are used, which are repeated again and again. The propaganda works on the emotions. It is directed at ordinary people, which it perceives as a mass and a collective group. It tries to build its legitimacy on science. It speaks strongly against the church. These are just overarching features of the use of this language. Now notice that one. It is directed at ordinary people, which it perceives as a mass and a collective group. So you've got a bit of identity politics in there, and that quote from Lobachevsky. Let me read it again, the short one. Pathocracy survives thanks to the feeling of being threatened by the society of normal people, as well as by other countries wherein various forms of the system of normal man persist. For the rulers, staying on top is therefore the classic problem of to be or not to be. So according to Lobachevsky, that's the hidden motivation behind this use of language. It is to create a division, not between the communists and the capitalists, but between essentially the psychopathological minority of a society and the entire society internal to that country and external of non-psychopathic, relatively normal people. That's the direction of this language. That's why it acquires. It doesn't just acquire. That's why it is injected with this moralizing. That's why words will acquire this additional this additional emotional flavor to it. It's because, like the way Lobachevsky describes, again, anything that threatens the system is like paramoralistically imputed to be bad, and everything that is good to the system is seen as good. So you get this rigid, like dichotomous thinking that is like inherent in the system. And what that actually means is that anything that is like good for humanity, good for you, like good for all these people, the public as individuals and as, you know, and as a group, is bad, essentially, if it means that it can threaten our, you know, our hold on power. Everything that supports our hold on power is therefore good. And you get these stark divisions between good and bad that are completely like opposite. They're topsy-turvy. They're 180 degrees from where they should be. That's why, you know, it feels like you're in some strange Kafkaesque world because everything's upside down. The moral structure of reality has been inverted to the point where now it's like, well, am I crazy? Like I thought things were a certain way, and it turns out, you know, everyone's saying it's the total opposite. Well, that's actually what's going on. It's like it is essentially like a mind control operation going on. It's a psychological operation done on you, and with the purpose of trying to reform your mind to be more psychopathic. Essentially, that's what it comes down to. At least, you know, that's the way Lobachevsky describes it. So just a few more examples of the specific language that was used. So she's got some examples from the 50s. New words that were, so these are either new words or words that just acquired a new meaning, a new frequency. So, for example, in the early 50s, you know, trying to still establishing the communist system and the Pythagorean system, agitators and propagandists popped up a lot at the phrase at agitation centers. Agitation centers were essentially like re-education centers, like indoctrination centers, that kind of things. Phrases like agitation through loudspeakers. A phrase like a dog's death for a dog. Phrases like subverting the republic, treason. Of course, negative connotations with all those. Positive connotations, the Soviet Union, our model. In the 1960s, this is, so during the Prague Spring, words like reformers, process of renewal, dogmatic, conservative, collaborators. In the 70s and 80s, so this is the continuation of the period of normalization, as she puts it. Well, the one that stood out to me, tearing the skin from the workers' backs. So this is a phrase that you just see, you know, regularly. You know, a cliche, like it becomes a cliche because it's used so often. That blood-stained dog, Tito. A happy future. Decaying capitalism. Expelled or deleted from the party. Pretenders, usurpers, traitors, disruptive elements. So these are all words that you'd see regularly in on the front page of the news, essentially. And then, but one of the points that both of them make is that there's this contrast between the official language, the language used in the propaganda and in the newspapers, and then the language that people actually spoke. And this was, I can't remember which one of them basically says, it's like, so this is the language that people would talk about or talk with when they were with like-minded people and they were sure, like, you know, the secret police weren't listening in. So at that point, they just used their own language, and they had like their own versions of certain words. So instead of using like the Czech word for party, they'd use another word that sounded more like the English word for party, for instance. So they'd avoid the use of the official communist terms for things and use their own words. Same with the word communism, even. Again, use a similar sounding word in Czech. Let's see if there's anything else. I think that might be about it. just here are some examples of words or phrases typical in this dictionary. So I'll just read a couple of these. The word agent, for instance, this is the first word we talked about. This occurred predominantly in the 1950s. So agent was equivalent to diversionist or spy. So the high occurrence of this word is the result of a phobia seeking out people perceived as trying to subvert the new regime. People working for the enemy intelligence organizations, trying to damage the communist order. And then examples of its use: an agent of the American intelligence service, agents of American imperialism, agents of Western imperialists, an agent of the bourgeoisie and an enemy of the Communist Party, CIA agents, with the help of a treacherous gang of agents. Gang is another word that was overused, again in the 50s. What was this gang of conspirators Slansky and his accomplices aiming at? Slansky and his criminal gang, a gang of Tito's supporters, smashing the treacherous and marauding gang of Clementis and company. Not one grain should go to waste. This is another phrase, a popular slogan, primarily during the period of collectivization. The slogan also came to be parodied. Just thought that was funny, et cetera, et cetera. So, just wait, where is that quote? Oh yeah, so I don't think I read the last quote from the conclusion. So this contrasts the language of the official language with the common language of the people, essentially. So the language of the ruled, as opposed to the rulers, is spoken language, reacting to the pressure of propaganda. It is highly creative, whereas the official language had no creativity. It often parodies official language, and it often uses humor. So, for example, I quoted this one, I think, last week. The example she gives is, to be made to leave the party of your own free will. And it also captures the atmosphere of the time, which was influenced by the way the communist regime functioned. So these must be like culturally significant because I don't really understand them, but the three examples are real jeans. I think that means, like, you know, when you'd actually get Levi's like smuggled in, and those were like real jeans, I think. And then a Tujek token. I think those were like those were tokens for like foreign currency, like on the black market. And Lenin wall, not sure what that one is. But I just thought that was really cool. Apparently, like, this was the first study of its kind, at least in Czech. And I don't know if it was a translation issue or what, but it sounded like in something that I read that it might be the first analysis of its kind, like in any language for the ex-Soviet countries. But
well, it's extremely valuable in terms of, you know, like a ponerological analysis of ideologies and language and how they, you know, they change when a pathocracy comes to power. You've got the implantation of a Soviet-style communist, government, and the changing of all of this language, and you get to see, how people reacted towards it, how they abandoned it whenever they had the chance that they felt safe enough to. And you also get to taste the flavor, really, and for a split second, you're kind of transported into that Kafkaesque world where, one person, just this word has so much going on underneath it. It's just a threat. This banal word carries this threatening overtone, and then like what was it, to being made to leave the party of your own free will, that kind of like just stupid humor, it's like authoritarian humor, like, it's just purely, just self-evidently crazy, but it's like, I'm the big boss, so we can get away with saying that because I make all of the rules.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy. Like, I had the same thoughts when I was reading like Gulag Archipelago, just how crazy that the use of the language is. Because, I mean, one of the points that we made last week that Lobachevsky also makes is that, you can have similar symptoms, similar features in different political systems, for instance. So you can have similar features in pathocracies as in any other like system of government. So, for example, every society has euphemisms. It's part of the use of language to try to cover over the less savory aspects of the unsavory aspects of reality in life. People use euphemisms, but to take like it's like you take that that phenomenon, and then in a Pythagorasy, it just gets like exponentially like, well, it becomes a caricature of itself. The euphemism becomes a caricature of euphemism. It's just so over the top. It's totally crazy, and it's not just prevalent. It's everywhere. So it's inescapable. You just see the euphemism used universally. It's like all you see is the euphemism. At least in in a more normal society, you have euphemisms, but you also have people using the regular word for what you're trying to cover over. In like when language is kind of taken over in this way, you lose the regular meaning. You're just left with the euphemism. You have to discern the meaning behind the euphemism, and that's what Lobachevsky says, is that that meaning is the meaning reserved for like the initiates. It's like the psychopathic meaning behind the reality, and we do have examples of those kinds of euphemisms too in the West, like extraordinary rendition, for instance. Trying to cover over something, or one that was used by the Nazis and the Americans, enhanced interrogation. So you have words like that, but when you have those two layers of meaning, what Lobachevsky points out is that the people naturally, because people aren't dumb, figure it out, right? They understand the meaning, and it's not just euphemisms either. It's like a euphemism, but there's got to be a word for it. Maybe there isn't. Like, it's something related to a euphemism. It's similar to a euphemism, but it's that kind of caricature level crazy. It's like it's not just like, what am I trying to say? Like, a euphemism is kind of generally regarded by the people that use it as a euphemism. They know what they're doing when they're using it. But there's something like extra malevolent about creating a word that seems to have a certain meaning, but that has this dark meaning underneath it. Like one of the words that the Nazis used was like evacuation. So when they were, during the war, when they were like killing villagers, on the warpath, they'd say that the villagers were evacuated. The village was evacuated. When that's obviously not what it meant. It wasn't even a euphemism. It's like it was just a lie. It's just lying with words. And what was the one example? One of the examples that from these Czech papers. What was the one? The one about censorship, democratization of culture and education. It's like there's something just sick about using words in that way. But getting back to the point about every culture has euphemisms, for instance, and every culture engages in these kinds of things. Every society engages in these kinds of things a little bit, right? You'll find it everywhere, but it just becomes it's like with the Pythagoric version. It is like you said. It's like stepping into this Orwellian, Kafkaesque kind of nightmare, where it's just like it's everywhere you turn. That, like, you can't escape it. And then at that point you have to, like, getting back to some of the things Lobachevsky describes, that's when you have to, people in this situation are forced to then reestablish the ties with their fellow people, because those human ties between people, they get cut, not just through the use of language, like through the use of various other techniques and forms of control, but language is a big one. Those ties get cut, so you feel isolated, and then I don't know how long it takes, but maybe it's different for individuals, maybe it's different for countries, but it takes a while to reestablish those ties with other people. And then at that point, that's when you get the this secondary language that comes up. And Lobachevsky talks about that too, just not in this section. The language of the 94%, he'd say, or something like that. It's their own. Well, they parody the official like jargon, and they make jokes about it. They understand the hidden meanings that gives them facility, in the use of that language. So they can either they themselves can then put on a mask, right? A mask to avoid getting arrested for using the wrong words, for outing themselves as potential, agents and saboteurs and class enemies, or insert, epithet here. they gain this extra kind of ability to speak in both languages, and that not only helps in interpersonally, but it helps in interacting with the system, essentially the man, to like the incompetent boss or manager, or political boss or political manager, and it's that natural language that brings people together again, and creates the kind of solidarity that can lead to the overthrow of the system. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about that.
Okay, yeah, if that was all you wanted to talk about with those papers, which is really interesting, I have to check those out. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this really great book that I read recently. It's I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It's called Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. It's by Mark Bray. And to kind of set the stage, I was listening last week, I think, to the Joe Rogan show, the powerful JRE, and he was interviewing Andy Ngo. And I'm pretty sure most of our listeners probably know who Andy Ngo is. He was recently attacked by a mob in Portland, Oregon, while he was covering a number of protests. One of them was an Antifa protest, and another one was a Proud Boys protest, and yet another one was some sort of a men's rights kind of protest. So Portland is just a complete hotbed of craziness. And he went down there to cover it, and he'd been doxxed and attacked before by Antifa because he is somewhat, center-right commentator and author and journalist, and I think even co-founder of the the online site Quillette. But so he'd been doxxed and targeted, but he went down there to cover it anyways, even though he'd been assaulted before. But when he went down there, he was ganged up on by, he thinks, like 6 to 12 people, and attacked, beaten with his his camera stolen, I believe. No police presence helped him. He wasn't helped at any point in a series of attacks. He ended up with brain lesions, I believe, bleeding on the brain. And so he went on the show to to discuss the assault, the fact that the Portland mayor did nothing, has allegedly, or has seemed to have ordered the police to stand down when Antifa groups assemble, and to talk about the dark side of the quote unquote anti-fascist movement. Because it was last week's show, we were talking about how important it is not to accept the name furnished by an ideology of a social movement that has succumbed to degenerative processes. That's something that Andrew Lobachevsky wrote in Political Ponerology, because the ideology itself is something far different from a movement that starts to embrace radical and pathological means of attaining its stated ends. And so throughout the course of their conversation, Joe Rogan and Andy Ngo are kind of going back and forth, because Rogan's like, well, I don't like fascists, so I can kind of get on board with what they're saying. And then Andy Ngo would say, well, do you support free speech? Do you support violence? Do you support the state? Because all of, they want to dismantle the state. They want to suppress free speech and all this. And then he recommended at the end reading Mark Bray's book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. So I decided I would pick it up and I would read what this Bray gentleman, who he's a lecturer at a college at this point, at Dartmouth College, but according to his bio, he was an organizer for Occupy Wall Street, one of the original organizers. And I was reading some of his articles, and one of them was like the 5 lessons we need to learn about libertarians in our radical movements. And he writes that the liberal tendencies of some occupiers severely undermine the movement's strength. Identifying them will make it easier to resist them next time. So he's not a big fan of quote unquote liberals. What he thinks of as individuals who are more intent on self-individualization and self-actualization than they are on completely dismantling the nation state. So I think that's why he identified Antifa, this anti-fascist kind of ideology for, because he's the author of this book, and I don't think there is actually another anti-fascist handbook out there, and I doubt that any real strict Antifa person is going to think that he's their spokesperson, because they're a very loosely knit organization of anarchists and everything. But he really succinctly argues for the Antifa point of view. He argues for why they behave, why they act in a certain way regarding violence, regarding who is a fascist and who's not, regarding racism, and he points out their identity in this book. So I thought it would be nice to kind of pull out some of the main themes and kind of see how he twists language, or how the language gets twisted. You throw in so many truths and then just twist the language here and there, and pretty soon you end up with a bunch of people beating up a gay journalist in the street in the name of diversity. But anyway, so this is what he writes on in terms of violence, which I think everyone could probably get behind. He said, "Wouldn't Americans consider it just as heroic to fight Nazis before the outbreak of war, while Hitler's regime was building camps and ghettos, or before Hitler even took power in 1933? How would Americans respond to a cinematic depiction of communist and social democratic organizations, such as the Red Front Fighters League, the Iron Front for Resistance Against Fascism, and another German anti-fascist group, when they fought the Nazi something in the 1920s and 30s? I like to imagine most Americans would sympathize with these militant formations, because they know that the story ultimately ends in the gas chambers." And so, what about when fascists do not pose an immediate physical threat? Is it better to ignore small, harmless fascist groups? By now, it should be clear that small fascist groups do not always remain that way. In Greece, Golden Dawn burst out of nowhere to become a major force poised to lead a government before criminal charges decimated party leadership in 2013. And he goes on to devote a big chunk of the book to discussing actual fights against actual fascists and actual Antifa groups in, Eastern Europe, who are going around and cleaning up neo-Nazi spray paint and everything. And he interviewed, these groups for his show or for this book, which was released in 2017, just right after that whole Charlottesville thing really went up in flames. And so you get this idea that that's what all that Antifa is that they're all just out there fighting guys, and they're, all these skinheads who are out to beat everybody up and to fight everybody. And then, he says, well, what if you don't know that they're fascist yet? Well, then, but they might still be. And so what if by beating up these people who could be fascists, we prevent the next Hitler? So you're like, okay, that's his, that's how he dedicates a large part of the book, is to really building up this theme of you're actually out there fighting Nazis. And so, you're like, well, shoot, I was all about fighting Nazis before fighting Nazis was cool. That's all Americans, that's just in the American blood, in the American mythos, is fighting Nazis. So you start with that, and then you go on, and he never really provides a good definition of what fascists are, but he does provide a good definition of whiteness. So this is what he says about whiteness. Whiteness is a moral choice, for there are no white people, James Baldwin explained, and we, who were not black before we got here either, were defined as black by the slave trade. And despite the popular perception that race is natural or timeless, the biological notion of race is a modern European invention. When race was invented, however, it was invented as the child of racism, not the father, as Ta-Nehisi Coates points out. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy so much as one of hierarchy. So he goes on to say that, if I can just find, so basically, whiteness is indefensible, is what he writes. So that's, fascism, he does end up giving a definition of fascism, but that's really beside the point, because he spends a large part of the book arguing that now it's not important just to fight fascism, because that was in the past. We have to redefine the enemy. And now the enemy is the far right. And on the far right is the white people and whiteness. Whiteness in and of itself is an indefensible construct that racism and fascism and all of these things come out of. So then, of course, your violence is justified in these terms because of, white privilege and white guilt. The entire idea that you would even think of yourself as white, if you were, is only to legitimate your own privilege and your own power over other people. Here's a definition of fascism that I got from Jonah Goldberg's Liberal Fascism: The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini to the Politics of Change. Fascism is a religion of the state. It assumes the organic unity of the body politic and longs for a national leader attuned to the will of the people. It is totalitarian in that it views everything as political and holds that any action by the state is justified to achieve the common good. It takes responsibility for all aspects of life, including our health and well-being, and seeks to impose uniformity of thought and action, whether by force or through regulation and social pressure. Everything, including the economy and religion, must be aligned with its objectives. Any rival identity is part of the problem, and therefore defined as the enemy. And that's right there. It's a pretty good definition of fascism. I mean, if you wanted to actually define fascism, and that's another thing that in this book, he never talks about the fact that it's not easy to define fascism. It's very specific historically. You have Nazis, and then you have the fascists, Mussolini's fascists. You don't get a sense that it's difficult at all to find a fascist. The idea is that you'll see it and you'll just know that it's a fascist, and then you just go punch it in the face, and then and that's all fine and good. That is the what would you say, the Rosetta Stone, really, through how they view everything, through how they view all of their activities. Is basically whatever gets them to that end of defeating fascism, which is very loosely defined, and it incorporates ideas like race, hierarchy, and the state. Anything that is organized. Basically, order itself seems to, in a large part, seems to be fascist to them. So anything is justified in that sense. Like you can beat up people in streets. You can block the streets. You can do black bloc mobs. As he points out, he says, an occasional black bloc in a sea of otherwise nonviolent action does not exclude anti-fascism or the Trump resistance movement more broadly from falling within a category of success. After all, a few black blocs were formed during the Egyptian movement, and that largely nonviolent revolution succeeded. And he goes on to say, to those who argue that our violence would make us no better than Nazis, we must point out that our critique is not against violence, incivility, discrimination, or disrupting speeches in the abstract, but against those who do so in the service of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, class oppression, and genocide. The point here is not tactics, it is politics. And then, of course, his screed on Trump is that while one should always be wary about painting large groups of people with a broad brush, it is clear that ardent Trump supporters voted for their candidate either because of or despite of his misogyny, racism, ableism, Islamophobia, and many more hateful traits. And these fascists fascism is marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, victimhood, and compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. I wonder if he even had a straight face on as he was writing this. You change one word, nationalist militants. You change that to Antifa militants, and it is 100% right on the nose. And so I'm reading through this, and I just couldn't get through the anti-fascist chapters because it just seems so disrespectful to the dead, in my opinion. It seems so disrespectful to the ancestors who did actually, fight, and to people who even today are actually out there, and there is a real threat of actual skinheads on the streets. Like, in Ukraine, you think about actual skinheads, actual violent, racist skinheads who want to kill everyone, who think the Jews are the worst problem, that, that they just have to have their ethnic nation state. And you see that, and you think, and then you compare that to somebody who wears a MAGA hat, and you think they're the same thing. That's what we were talking about last week when we were talking about just a delusional system. There's something wrong going on. You're not seeing things straight. And then now you're using this as a justification for violence against the people that you're stating that you want to help. And so, I mean, you just reading through the book, the best parts are where he's really getting down into the identity of Antifa, why their tactics are justified, why they are why they should be praised for going out and shutting down conservative speakers. It's like you're defining anybody who, as we've said, is left of Marx as a conservative, and in your mind, every conservative is on the far right. What you've done, it's like in a culture, it's like a marriage, right? Like a man and a woman, they're married. Each one of them is crazy, but they kind of complement one another, right? That's like the same thing in society. You have the left and you have the right. Both are crazy, but they need one another to at least stay sane. When you create that division where it's like literally everyone that doesn't share your political opinion is Hitler, there's nowhere to go but down for society as a whole. You really do need a liberal perspective on things. You need some openness to new experiences, openness to other cultures, a willingness to bring in more other ideas, new ideas, and then but you still need tradition, and you still need conservatives who are willing to say, well, now hold on. Let's not just go put on our black hoods and go beat up old men in the streets. But the biggest thing I think from reading that book is that there is a commitment, I think, to making Antifa an identity, and it does seem to be something that would be attractive to people who don't have a wider awareness of politics, people who've been sheltered and who've lived in like a very left-leaning city or whatever for their whole life, and all they hear is left-leaning ideological talking points. And so then eventually anybody who disagrees with that, you're like, oh my God, what a monster. Somebody who doesn't believe in affirmative action. It's like, oh my God, what? That's Hitler himself. He must be racist. You're like, no, people can have different opinions and not be racist. Well, no, not according to Antifa. If you're white, you're racist because whiteness is racism. Where do you, what? How do you talk with somebody like who thinks that?
That just made me think. So you're talking about all these, the hypothetical individual who grows up in like a left-leaning region or city or community and doesn't really have access to a lot of outside experience of people and culture outside of that specific monoculture that they were raised in. That it seems very kind of humorous and ironic to me that a lot of those individuals, those progressive individuals that might grow up to be Antifa members, probably haven't traveled. Because a lot of Americans, I think Americans have a very low percentage of people who actually travel to foreign countries. They travel a lot. People might travel a lot within the United States. So maybe you vacation in a different state, or you've moved to a different state, or whatever. But for people who've actually been to completely foreign cultures, chances are a lot of these kids have never been immersed in a foreign culture. I think if they were to do that, they would be kind of very rudely disabused of a lot of their, preconceptions about the way the world works and about what their own society is like. Not because a lot of the issues, it's really like, it's a kind of a cliche, but it's like first world problems kind of things. It's like you're looking around the world and finding all of these like horrible, fascist things going on, when really it's like small potatoes compared to a lot of the stuff that's going on in the world, not within the borders of your own country. And there are a lot of things going on within the borders of your own country that you don't even bring attention to, because there's a lot of bad stuff that goes on that doesn't get attention. But going back to like the thing about other cultures, like if they were to go to another culture and just see like what we would call in the West like racism, that's just like everyday life. It's like you go to Japan and it's like Japan is very like mono-racial, and you can go to you can see signs on stores saying, no non-Japanese, no Chinese, no white people, Japanese only. You go to China, same thing, no Japanese, or there's particular aspects, like if racism's a circle with a whole bunch of different characteristics, like you can find those characteristics like prevalent all over the place in different races, and some of it's overblown, a lot of it isn't. A lot of if progressives like experienced a lot of the racism that actually exists in other parts of the world, they might be shocked. Or they might not be, because racism isn't actually racism according to this like philosophy. You might think that racism is, thinking that everyone of a particular skin color, for instance, has the same traits and might be negative traits, but that's not actually, it's not racism isn't like generalizing about someone or some group. At least not according to like the postmodern leftist perspective that they're taught in universities. Racism is power and privilege, and that's it. It has nothing to do with actual like what we'd think of as race. So like Asian people can't be racist. African people can't be racist. It's just it's not part of the ideology. So that's another weird thing.
Well, yeah. Well, because as he writes, Europeans invented races. This is something that he just squeaks in there. Like it's just a generally accepted fact that nobody in the history of humanity ever noticed a difference between races. Between, Asian, black, white, nobody noticed the difference, and they didn't have any words for it. It wasn't until, Francis Galton or somebody decided to come up with a word to justify whiteness that race even existed. And so it doesn't exist. I mean, he argues that point in the book. And so, like you were talking about the crazy sense, like, did I just enter a crazy world? So I was sitting there, I was like, well, that is the most bonkers idea. No wonder a lot of these guys don't go on, right-wing radios to, have discussions and debates, because how could you say that and that doesn't get lambasted? I mean, like the Greeks had so many different words for different tribes, cultures, cities, and like so many different nuanced ways of viewing ethnicity and race, that it was just, to say that it didn't exist until modern Europeans invented it for the purpose of, conquering people is, it's just such a big, ridiculous lie that to believe it. I mean, you would just have to think that, wow, they're the most evil people who ever existed. They just came into this Garden of Eden and created this concept just to control everybody. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't get much worse than that.
Like I can almost see the point that either he was trying to make or that might have inspired that, because technically he's right in that scientific racism, as a concept didn't exist because it was a product of its time. Scientific racism, like, social Darwinism. It's like, but that in itself is a very specific thing, and it's not like everyone that they call racist today is a scientific racist. It's like, or eugenicist. It's like that way of thinking. There are still some people around the world that think like that, but it's very rare. It's like in the late 1800s, it was very widespread to think in eugenicist terms. It's like that was kind of the natural way of thinking about things. It's like you wanted good breeding, well, and it wasn't even primarily necessarily along racial lines. It was more along class lines. Good breeding among the upper class. If the upper class happened to be white, it might be primarily white, like white good breeding, but it didn't have to be. So in that sense, he's kind of right that racism as like a specific ideology didn't exist. But that ideology
he's talking about the biological notion of race. Like the whole entire the fact like doesn't exist. Yeah. There's no such thing. We're all the same.
Mm-hmm. But being white is bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, it's kind of bonkers, kind of crazy.
A little bit.
Maybe to end today's show, did you have George Orwell's definition of fascism?
I don't have it. I have it paraphrased.
You can paraphrase it.
Orwell's definition of fascism is anything not desirable.
Yeah, because I like that.
Anything I don't like.
I think that was in might have been like an article or a column that he wrote. I think it's like, to find it in print, it might just be in one of those collected works of George Orwell. It might be in like that slim volume, like The Political Use of Language or something. There's some thing that he wrote, but I found it, a year or two ago, and I read it, and he was pointing that out. He was wondering, well, what exactly is fascism? And you look around, and that's pretty much the conclusion he came to, that the way the word was used was pretty much anything I don't like is fascist. That's what fascism is. It just became similar to the way we started this show with the use of language in Soviet societies. It was that word, it just acquires a certain meaning. It's like socialism in the States. Like, socialism is a bad word, even if you don't know, like, whether you know what you're talking about or you don't. It's a bad word. Just like fascism is. It's like fascism is bad. Communism is bad. Well, those things very well might be bad for particular reasons, but that doesn't enter into the thought process, the equation. It's just like a Pavlovian response. It's like, ooh, bad thing. So if I see a bad thing, then I can call that bad thing a fascist, regardless of whether it's an actual fascist or not. And that's the main problem. It's that, and he even, if I remember correctly from one of those first quotes, he even justifies it. It's that, oh, well, what if that person that you're beating up isn't actually a fascist? It's like, oh, well, they could be a fascist. And, who would you be if that person might be a fascist and might be the future Hitler, and I'm beating him up, then won't you look bad for criticizing me for beating up this guy? It's like, Jesus, like
set the bar any lower,
yeah,
please.
It's like, so just let's think this through, all right? It's like, I could just go around randomly hitting people, randomly beating people, and who are you to criticize me? Because one of those people might be the future Hitler. So how dare you? It's like, how dare you criticize me for beating up random people?
Well, here, I just want to finish one more quote about how pro-free speech he thinks that Antifa is. He says, I will observe that the anti-authoritarian position held by the majority of Antifa is actually far more pro-free speech than that put forward by others, by liberals. The false assumption that the United States maximizes free speech rests on the unstated fact that this right only applies to non-incarcerated citizens. In contrast, anti-authoritarians seek to abolish prisons, states, and the very notion of citizenship, thereby eliminating this black hole of rightlessness. I mean, wow. Just such a great concept.
Yeah,
that's how pro-free speech. I mean, it doesn't matter if they come and they're beating you up and they won't let you speak. They still want to let all of the criminals out.
Well, just
to run the streets.
Yeah.
Open the borders up, let the MS-13 in, so everybody gets their free speech. Well, see, that's what I'm saying. Is like the problem is, it seems like order in and of itself is fascism. Any sort of restraint on behavior in any form is evil. I don't like it, so
Yeah.
I'm going to punch you.
And I just think like hearing something like that, that's what leads me to think that, Lobachevsky, right? And in a group like that, like you can't, I don't think you can say something like that without having at least a little bit of something wrong going, something going wrong, at least a little bit in your head. It's like there needs to be a little bit of mental illness there to be able to say such a thing. And not only mental illness, like a little bit of malevolence, like on some level, he's got to know what that means. And anyone,
He's clearly a very intelligent person.
because, and what does that mean? Like, so just like you can look at, a pathocratic euphemism and find the meaning behind it, the hidden intended meaning. It's like, well, what is the actual result and goal of that kind of a, like, let's say a policy position? It is, okay, let's take the absolute worst people that are incarcerated, like a lot of them for a good reason, probably most of them for a very good reason, and let's let them loose. The only reason you would want to do that is to create havoc, to unleash psychopathy on the world in its most base, violent form.
Yeah.
Because you're not saying let's release all the people like arrested and imprisoned for nonviolent drug crimes or anything like that. No, you're saying let's get rid of the entire prison system and just let them all go free. Well, I think for anyone that's saying something like that or proposing something like that, I think that all of those people should be given the opportunity. They should be of their own free will to enter like a maximum security prison and be put in the wing with the serial killers and the pedophiles and the child rapists and child killers, and just see what happens. All right. That's my policy position. Okay, so I think that's for today.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty good place to leave it.
All right. Yeah. Send them all to prison of their own free will.
Hit like and subscribe of your own free will.